Okay, in this video, we are going to discuss Locke's approach to what we might call the dissolution of government. Now, the way of putting that is, in what sort of situations would A, we might recognize governments as changing, and B, would we recognize justification for rebellion against a certain government? Right, so first of all, we need to recognize that Locke thought that and argued that a sovereignty is not above the law, right? This is something that we might recognize in our own political culture today, right? So some political group of people are not in a position of being able to break whatever laws they want, right? So if you've got a politician or a president or what have you, they must obey the same laws that are put into place by the legislator because it's the people who have elected them to power, and they're just another person. They're not given some divine right by God, right? So the sovereign community must also obey the law. They're not above the law. Now, there are various reasons that Locke articulates for why we might think that some political community, some government might change, right? So on the one hand, there's cases where you have foreign conquest, right? So maybe there is a war that happens, and so boundaries and country borders change because of it. That might be one reason to think that the government could change. Another reason is because maybe the legislation itself changes, or maybe we have some change in the way in which the legislatures work. That might be a kind of a change in government. There also might be situations where the government cannot effectively enforce laws, and so you might have to change government in order to be able to provide enforcement of laws. But the one that I want to pay attention to for our purposes is a situation where the government exercises arbitrary power. So what does that mean? How should we think of this understanding of arbitrary power? For Locke, arbitrary power can be understood insofar as the sovereign acts contrary to what's best for the people, right? So if the sovereign is putting into place laws that are going to be bad for the people who elected the sovereign, well, then that's going to be arbitrary power, which is bad, right? Because it's bad for the community, it's bad for the people, right? So that would be one sort of situation. A very explicit case of this would be tyranny, or a kind of a tyrant. This was in your reading. Locke discusses this sort of situation. But in the case of a tyrant, it is not the tyrant. It is the tyrant and not the people who are acting contrary to natural law, to God's will, if you will. Right? So in those sort of situations, the tyrant sort of relinquishes whatever legitimate right to rule he or she or they had. And so in that sort of a situation, rebellion is not wrong. Think about how this relates to what Hobbes argued, right? Hobbes argued that we could never rebel against a tyrant because we were the ones that elected them, right? So if we were to rebel against a tyrant, we would be essentially rebelling against ourselves. Well, Locke thinks that that's not exactly the right approach. On the one hand, he thinks that, well, we're really rational people, generally speaking, and so we wouldn't simply rebel any old time we felt like it. It would require some really serious sort of situation where we would rebel. Namely, a situation where the tyrant is no longer acting in accordance with what's best for the people. Now, the way of putting that is the tyrant would be acting or putting into place arbitrary laws that are against the natural law. So it's not the people who are acting contrary to natural law. Rather, it's the tyrant that's acting contrary to natural law. And insofar as the tyrant is acting contrary to natural law, the tyrant is kind of no longer in a legitimate form of authority. So rebellion is not against legitimate authority. Rather, it's the right kind of rebellion. It's rebellion against illegitimate authority. And insofar as we can think of that approach to the disillusionment of government, then we can compare that to Hobbes's view of why rebellion is always going to be wrong. We can also think about how that relates to Martin Luther King Jr.'s view of a nonviolent resistance to what he thought of as being an illegitimate form of government, or certain institutionalized aspects of our government. Indeed, Dr. King argues that we need a radical sort of realignment of political authority. And presumably that's because the political authority that was in place at that time, maybe even today, largely was an illegitimate form of authority. It was a form of authority that was exercising arbitrary powers that was not in the best interest for all of the people. So those are the sort of issues that I want you to think about as you are watching the remaining few videos for this module.